For those of you that are in the line, we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. I'm Matt Scherger, Senior Fellow with the Energy Systems Integration Group. Welcome, everyone, to this ESIG webinar on Integrated Planning, Foundations Guidebook, and Optimization. For those of you that are not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of clean energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. For those of you who are members, thank you for your support. It makes possible these webinars and the other work that we do. The way we do our work is through task forces that synthesize best practices or do analysis and modeling to answer questions. One of our task forces is on integrated planning. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website at www.esig.energy or find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. The Energy Systems Integration Group has just released a set of 3 reports on integrated planning, outlining a framework and set of walk, jog, run steps that planners can use to move forward toward integrated planning for electricity, generation, transmission, and distribution, and customer loads and resources. Traditional electricity planning practices have often been siloed, with planners in the 4 areas maintaining separate planning teams, models, data inputs, and vocabularies. But this siloed approach is no longer sufficient to address today's ongoing transformations, accelerating load, rapid technology development, the growth of solar, wind, and battery resources, evolving extreme weather events, and the emerging need to consider integration across coupled energy systems. To address these challenges, ESIG convened a task force of experts from utilities, system operators, research organizations, national laboratories, consultants, and other planning practitioners to define integrated planning opportunities and document practical steps that planners can take toward a comprehensive planning approach. We'd like to thank DOE and LBNL for helping to fund some of this work. This week, we have published 3 new reports that you see on the screen here. Foundations of Integrated Planning, defining a framework for comprehensive energy system planning. E3 led this work. This introduction defines the large scope of integrated planning and shows how the following 2 reports fit into that scope. The second of the 3 reports is an Integrated Planning Guidebook, a practical coordination framework for electricity planners. Encoord led this work, and it describes practical steps for either generation, transmission, distribution, or customer planners to consider the other planning domains as they execute their own planning. And the third of the three reports that we released this week is Optimization for Integrated Electricity Planning, Opportunities for Integrated Planning and Capacity Expansion Models. This was led by E3, and it looks at future ways to optimize system expansion, not just generation capacity expansion. As I noted, this work has been guided by an excellent expert task force. I'd like to thank the task force members for their robust engagement and contributions. And I'd also like to thank Aaron Burdick for his great work coordinating this set of task force meetings. This is our agenda for today. We've got 90 minutes in this webinar to cover the three reports. We'll hear first from Aaron Burdick, who is the Director of Integrated System Planning at Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3. Next, we'll hear from Jacob Kravits, Research and Development Lead at encoord. And then we'll wrap up with going back to Aaron Burdick for the final report from E3. We plan to take a question or two after each of the three presentations, and then we'll target to save about 15 minutes for questions at the end of the towards the end of the webinar. And we're planning to adjourn again after 90 minutes at 2:30 Eastern today. So just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we've moved to the Slido platform. So we're asking you to enter your questions through Slido at slido.com. If you would please go to slido.com and enter ESIG 17, ESIG 17 as the event code. You can find that in the chat as well. And if you could, when you enter your question, please indicate which presenter your question is directed to. The instructions are also at the bottom of this screen. When you're in Slido, you'll see a thumbs up button next to questions that will allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions that are submitted. And again, as I noted, we're planning to take a couple of questions after each presentation and then have about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of all three presentations. An email link will be provided once the video file of today's webinar has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to answer questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido with the event code ESIG 17. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And I'll turn the floor over to Aaron to present the first of our three reports today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. My screen coming through all right?
Looks great.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. Great to be with you here today. So I am Aaron Burdick, Director in the Integrated System Planning Group at E3. And E3 had the fortune of working with some of the inaugural integrated planning efforts at Hawaiian Electric and Salt River Project. And it's been an honor and a privilege to work with the ESIG team and our esteemed task force members over the last year or so on these white papers, helping to form some of the foundational definitions and initial best practices for integrated planning. So I want to just really start by thanking ESIG for this opportunity and thanking the task force for their great contributions to this effort. So I'll start today talking about the first in the white paper series, Foundations of Integrated Planning. This paper sets the why, what, and how of integrated planning. So we start with why do integrated planning at this time? What are some of the drawbacks of the historical siloed approach? What is integrated planning? We have a definition that we propose, and then how to do integrated planning. So there's a four-part framework outlined in this paper. and we discuss some of the key information flows between different planning processes that are foundational to a comprehensive approach. So Matt already touched on some of these key drivers for integrated planning. We see great opportunities and challenges in planning the electricity system over the next few decades. So we have this paradigm shift with rapidly accelerating load growth, albeit with a lot of uncertainty. We have new technologies. Those include batteries, floating offshore wind turbines. We have growth in inverter-based resources that are changing the way that we have to think about planning and system operations. We have decarbonization policies that are pushing the rate of resource additions beyond which we have seen of late. And we have these opportunities amidst additional challenges as well. So we have aging infrastructure, often with a 20th century grid that we are maintaining while trying to build out all of this new load and new resources. There are evolving extreme weather events and climate change. And then we also have had advances in modeling and cloud computing. So these advances have helped to support some of the more advanced analytical approaches that will be talked about today within the context of integrated planning. So when we think about electricity planning, as Matt teed up, we generally can think about these four types of silos: generation, transmission, distribution, and customer programs and DERs. So they each have their own planning horizons, their own processes, their own people, their own conferences, their own vocabulary. And, you know, I will say not all planning has been as siloed as shown here. So there have been efforts. For instance, we have integrated resource planning, which was intended to bring more of the DERs and DSM opportunities into the generation planning process. But for the most part, we've had this siloed approach. And this has worked okay in the past when we had investments within each of these planning domains that had limited impact on the others. But when we think about the investments of today and tomorrow, that's no longer the case. So we have remote renewable resources being added to the grid that require transmission to reach load centers. We have electric vehicles that could serve as potential generation assets, as well as potentially flex their charging to support distribution system needs. We have batteries that can serve generation and renewable integration needs and can be installed on the bulk grid, on distribution grids, or behind the customer meter. So we need a planning process that reflects the increasing complexity of the power system. So that's what integrated planning can allow us to do, is to capture that complexity. And this is the definition that we worked up with the task force's input. Integrated planning is a comprehensive energy system planning approach that coordinates across systems to develop affordable, reliable, and robust investment plans. So as noted, it coordinates across these four historical silos within electricity system planning, and it may also consider interactions between the electric power system and other energy systems. We'll be talking more about that shortly. So we move from this siloed approach to this comprehensive approach shown on the right here. So why should folks pursue integrated planning? So I want to talk about some of the key outcomes. I like to think of it in terms of these three categories. So we want to have the right investments made. When we talked about the opportunities earlier, over the next 20-ish years, we're looking at trillions of dollars of investment in the electric power system in the United States and much more all across the world. So we want to make sure that we're making the right investments. So that includes the right mix of generation resources. It also includes the right mix of load flexibility versus bulk grid resources, and investments in the grid versus resource or non-wires alternatives. We want those investments to be in the right places. So this involves doing more geospatially granular planning for loads and resources. involves considering where to site new resources like battery storage and where to build new grid infrastructure. And then we want that investment to happen at the right times. So we want to have the grid built out to support new loads as well as new resource needs. And we want to ensure that customers see the right incentives through their rate designs that signal when the grid has value for their resources. So in combination, integrated planning can lead to new solutions to meet grid needs that can lower total system costs. This can be done through identifying and validating value stacking opportunities. So we came up with a 4-pillar framework for integrated planning that serves as the core of this white paper, the foundations paper. And those are shown here. So the first is the integration of inputs. This is aligning inputs, assumptions, scenarios, and data structures across planning processes. This really sets a foundation from which to build upon. Then you have the integration of analysis. So this is about determining the key data flows between your economic and your physical planning models that are necessary to reach a comprehensive solution. Third, we have the integration of actions. So this is about after you've completed the planning process, how you determine what infrastructure to actually go build after the planning cycle or between planning cycles. And then integration with decision-making. So recognizing that the regulatory and decision-making structures across the planning domains are often diverse. We want to ensure that integrated planning processes are designed initially to fit within those structures so that the great work that's done by planning analysts can actually go inform real-world infrastructure decisions and build-outs. So I'll be digging into each of these for the remainder of this presentation. So as I noted, integration of inputs involves creating integrated scenarios, input assumptions, and data structures. It also involves aligning planning horizons. So on the slide here, you can see the extended integrated planning horizon across each of the 4 planning domains. And we have often looked far out for generation and transmission planning. Planning cycles for distribution and customer programs tend to be shorter. But to reach an integrated solution, we really need to align the planning horizon for scenario planning, even if we won't necessarily lock in all of our investment decisions, for instance, for distribution 15 years of the future, like we may for certain transmission assets. So this is really foundational. It's about aligning the planning processes, integrating the scenarios that go into them and the horizons upon which they consider. For integration of analysis, I'll start off by saying there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So you can think about integrated planning on a small island grid like Hawaii. It's going to look much different than planning the ISO New England system. We have a variety of regulatory regimes in the US and across the world. So things are going to look much different for a vertically integrated utility versus a deregulated market. But the focus should really be on implementing the necessary data linkages between models. And this integrated analysis can use co-optimization when that's feasible. We'll be talking more about that when we return to the 3rd paper in this series. And it can also use iterative coordinated modeling processes. So this diagram from the paper shows some of the key data flows that are necessary to support integrated planning. So we have in detail the generation, transmission, distribution, customer program, and DER analytical processes that form the foundation for planning within those domains. We also note some of the ways that economy-wide energy systems and gas system planning may interact with electric planning. So on the left part of this slide in those boxes, you see load and DER forecasts that are really foundational to determining planning needs. So those need to be aligned across planning processes and downscaled geospatially to the appropriate granularity, be that transmission buses or distribution circuits. We have a resource option study, which historically has looked at generation resource options on the bulk grid, but increasingly may consider distributed energy resources as well as grid upgrade options. And then we have that flowing into a capacity expansion optimization that's been historically used within generation planning. We'll talk about ways that some of these other constraints may be put into that optimization later today. And then you have a flow of increasingly detailed operational modeling. So you have production cost modeling that flows into transmission studies, looking at congestion and reliability and stability of the transmission grid. You have distribution studies that consider power flow, reliability, asset health, and are increasingly considering opportunities for non-traditional investments like non-wires alternatives. And then you have all of these informing customer programs and DER planning. So that includes looking at cost effectiveness for program design. It also includes forecasting customer adoption of these types of resources informed by the value that they can provide to the grid. In the paper, we have a multi-page table that goes into each of those data flows in more detail, focusing on the connections between each of the planning processes. So I've already talked through some of these examples called out here. A more expansive resource option study, geospatial allocation of load forecasts informed by energy system modeling, and so on. So I invite folks to dig into those tables. There's a lot of great material there, and we got a lot of great input from the task force to inform this. So the first year of the ESIG Integrated Planning Task Force really focused on electricity system planning. However, we did in this foundations paper want to recognize that there are opportunities to coordinate the electricity system with other energy systems, including gas system planning and planning for economy-wide energy systems like buildings, transportation, and industry. So when we think about those energy systems, there's been a lot of great work done in the context of decarbonization policies, looking at pathways to meet, for instance, net zero energy economy targets. And within that, look at coupling of sectors to explore how to optimize, for instance, between transportation decarbonization and electricity system planning. So those types of pathway scenarios really form a foundational set of scenarios that can then flow into gas and electricity system planning. So you have a set of electrification forecasts or multiple scenario forecasts going into electricity system planning. From electricity system planning, you have the estimated electricity costs and infrastructure needs. You have similarly a forecast of gas system throughput that can support gas system planning and gas rates and the costs of decarbonized gas that can feed back into decarbonization pathways modeling. And then between electricity and gas system planning, you have coordination that can occur both at the bulk grid through looking at gas availability and deliverability for resource adequacy. And then you also have the opportunity for local planning coordination, for instance, in decarbonizing regions, considering non-pipeline alternatives like electrification to as alternatives to building out additional gas delivery infrastructure. And in the paper, we include an example of some work that E3 did in this space in Rhode Island a few years ago. And so here we show 4 different integrated scenarios that inform planning for the gas system and for electricity system needs. So you can see here, these all are varying degrees of decarbonization, and that impacts the gas system significantly. So you have some scenarios where you have very few gas customers left by 2050, other scenarios where you have almost the same amount of gas customers as today, but they may be using hybrid heat pumps and the gas system more as a backup to the electric power system. And each of these scenarios can then inform electricity system planning. So you see here the peak demand on the right side of the screen with vastly different peaks and the associated impacts on generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure needs. So this is an example of the type of integrated scenario analysis that can be done coordinating between electricity and other sectors. So the third pillar of the framework, integration of actions. So this is a figure from the paper here showing how out of your planning process come a series of action plans. So those could be individual within each planning domain. You could have an integrated action plan across all of them. So for generation, that includes the planned resource investments or procurement, such as all source RFOs. For transmission, that includes traditional wires investments, such as new long distance transmission lines, as well as alternative investments like storage as a transmission resource. The distribution action plan includes similarly wires investments, grid modernization, as well as the opportunity for targeted customer or DER programs to support distribution needs. And then for customer and DER programs, you have the cost effectiveness evaluation that can support creating the right types of programs that provide value to the grid. You also have the opportunity to align rate design incentives with system value coming out of the planning process. And then lastly, I'll note at the bottom, as I talked about earlier, doing integrated planning is really focused on exploring some novel types of solutions to grid needs. So pilot programs are really critical between planning processes to validate these assumptions. So that may involve looking at new technologies, new commercial models, new operational regimes, and using pilot programs between planning cycles can really ensure that planners have confidence and reliance on being able to assume these new types of novel solutions. And then lastly, integration into decision making. So on the right side of this slide, you see a lot of the stakeholders that are involved in the planning process or in the decision making process. So first off, want to recognize there's just a wide variety of folks who want to engage in planning processes. And there may actually be different decision makers for different planning domains. So you can think of who's going to decide about the transmission investments that could be at a federal level of jurisdiction versus the distribution system investments that may be regulated by a state utility commission. And the basic message that we have here is that design of planning processes should really be done in the context of who's going to make the infrastructure decisions coming out of them. So we tee up a set of key questions that can inform that type of design. So what are the objectives for the planning process? What decisions will be made? Who's going to make those decisions and when? Who are the stakeholders that should be involved in reviewing the planning process inputs and results, and how should they be engaged? And then how can decisions be adaptive or robust? So adaptive meaning we're not locking ourselves in, we can change as possible infrastructure plans as realities evolve. And robust meaning when we do need to make a decision on a large investment such as a new transmission line, it is robust and risk tested across a lot of different future scenarios. And then lastly, we conclude the foundations paper by teeing up this walk, jog, run framework that continues throughout the other papers. And here we're kind of summarizing at a very high level how folks can get started in integrated planning. So it starts with determining your objectives, doing a gap assessment of what your existing planning processes may be missing, and then aligning inputs and scenarios as some of the key low-hanging fruit. Then you get into the jog phase, which is about connecting existing analytical processes, potentially evolving your stakeholder engagement approach, and considering organizational changes or agreements between planning entities. And then the run stage, we will talk more later this morning about opportunities for co-optimization and some of the advanced analytical methods to support integrated planning. And with that, I will pass it back to Matt.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. Great presentation. I want to remind people to go to slido.com. ESIG 17 is the event code to enter your questions. We'll take a question now, but we'll work to keep 10 or 15 minutes at the end of all three presentations to get further into questions. So Aaron, just one right now. We have a question. In order to set an adequate scenario scene, storylines, what do you think about dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's when we talked about adaptive and robust planning, that's one approach. So when we're talking about looking at longer planning horizons and large infrastructure decisions, we want to ensure that those infrastructure decisions are informed by a broad range of scenarios, and using adaptive pathways is one way to ensure that those decisions are made at the times that they need to be made while maintaining that type of optionality. So I think that's one really useful approach for decision making under uncertainty, which is really a key concept for all planners.
Great. I see questions rolling in now. Keep those coming, folks. We'll work to get to as many of those as we can at the end. Those that we don't get to, we'll try to answer and send out following the webinar. And if you can indicate who your question is or directed to, that would be helpful too. Let's move on to our second presentation. Jacob, you're up.
Beautiful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right, well, welcome. I am Jacob Kravits, the Research and Development Lead at encoord. That stands for Energy Coordination. And I'm really proud to be presenting today on behalf of my team, which includes Wallace Kenyon, you'll hear from him in a little bit, and the Integrated Task Force on the Integrated Planning Guidebook. Now, before I get into the guidebook, I want to thank ESIG for all their support on this effort, specifically Matt and Debbie, thank you so much, as well as Aaron from E3, who you just heard from, for his leadership in this effort, and all the task force members. So the name of the game with this guidebook is practicality. How can we give planners a single approachable reference to help them along their integrated planning journey, no matter what stage they're in? Integrated planning it isn't an all or nothing approach, right? How do we unlock value along the way? These were some of the guiding principles of the Integrated Planning Guidebook. But the great thing is that this resource wasn't prepared in a vacuum. We actually get to build on the foundation that Aaron just laid out in that foundations paper. So he actually just showed this in a list. He showed how integrated analysis may use co-optimization, or it may use co-simulation or iterating between a few different modeling domains. And then there's also approaches that sort of iterate between co-optimization and co-simulation. Now that first approach, stay tuned. Aaron's going to talk all about that after me. But these other two approaches, these are really sort of where the guidebook lives, right? How can we give planners some practical approaches to coordinate planning across their teams and planning areas, and use co-simulation to inform co-optimization and vice versa? So how does the guidebook do this? Right here is just a layout of the chapters. The guidebook quickly outlines the drivers of integrated planning. Then in the next chapter, it defines integrated planning using the same definition that was established in that foundations paper. But it acknowledges that integrated planning only works if planners understand their planning context. So the next chapter defines the areas of power system planning and the modeling domains within each of those planning areas across consistent dimensions. Now, the next chapter is really the heart of the guidebook. It's our integrated planning framework where we give you practical modeling workflows for existing planning interfaces using that walk, jog, run framework that Aaron just talked about. Now, oftentimes integrated planning workflows are viewed as slightly more complex than existing workflows. And so the next chapter shows the value that you get for that added complexity. Integrated software is here, integrated planning software is here to help. And that's really what that next chapter talks about. We highlight some of the key concepts that make integrated planning practical from a software perspective for today's planners. And the final chapter outlines how integrated planning actually gets implemented, right? What are some of the organizational challenges and opportunities for integrated planning? Now, throughout the entire guidebook, we have industry spotlights, and those are taken from our literature review and from expert interviews that we conducted to inform the writing of this guidebook. So my goal for the remainder of this presentation is to give you a flavor of the content of the guidebook. It's an 80-page document, right? So I have to gloss over some things, but I just want to give you a flavor of the types of content that are presented within the guidebook. So, like I said, this document was not prepared in a vacuum. We used the same 4 planning areas that Aaron introduced: generation, transmission, distribution, and customer planning. Now, Aaron did a great job of motivating these challenges, so I'm not really going to rehash those here. But one thing that is unique to the guidebook is that these challenges manifest themselves differently across the different planning areas. And in fact, it's because these problems impact each planning area in a unique way, we need to think about integrated planning solutions that span multiple planning areas. Now, again, practicality. What does that mean in practice? Well, in practice, we need to think of practical approaches to incorporate short-term operational details into long-term planning, and do that, where feasible. And again, we're going to talk in more detail about what that looks like in a second. Now, before you even think about integrated modeling, it's important for planners to understand where they fit in the planning context, where they fit in the planning process. So to facilitate that understanding, we use consistent dimensions, the consistent dimensions of scope, scale, horizon, and action. And we apply those 4 dimensions to the 4 planning areas that I just talked about. Now, it's not unique that we've defined the scope, scale, horizon, and action of generation planning. That's been well understood for decades. You can find that in textbooks. But what is unique and where there is value is that we're defining them in a single resource, right, and across consistent dimensions. And again, the intention there is to allow planners to understand their planning context. Now, here we applied scope, scale, horizon, action to the 4 planning areas. But we also apply scope, scale, horizon, and action to the modeling domains within each of those planning areas. So here I'm showing a table. Each of these bullets is a modeling domain that is used within the planning area. And for each of these bullets, we define the scope, scale, horizon, action, as well as the key inputs and outputs of the model. Now, again, you can see I can't go into detail on all these modeling domains for this presentation. So I really encourage you to go to the guidebook, for all the really cool, nitty-gritty details. But the great thing about this guidebook is that it's, again, this single reference for all of these modeling domains. And again, the idea is so that planners can start to understand how are my model outputs being used as inputs by other models. What are my planning counterparts? What types of analysis are they doing, and how do the assumptions that I make impact them? Right. So again, it's about planners understanding their planning context. So now that they understand their context, we're ready to start thinking about workflows. Now, as Aaron motivated, we take this walk, jog, run approach. So in interviewing a lot of the different planners and from our task force discussions, we really, came to the understanding that integrated planning is really a spectrum, right? And Aaron motivated this in the previous presentation. But when we talk about walk, jog, run, we're talking about in the walk phase is about communication and understanding. How can I build trust in my planning counterparts? In the jog phase, it's about aligning data, right? Aligning the key assumptions, right? How do we make sure that we're passing information in consistent ways across these planning areas? And in the run phase, that's where we really talk about integrated modeling processes. And again, what I want to emphasize is that there's value along the way. It's not like, oh, there's no value until you get to run. No, there's actually a ton of value, especially from our interviews. Sometimes the most value you can get can be in some of those earlier stages. So we apply this walk, jog, run framework to different planning interfaces. So again, this guidebook is about providing a single reference. So we included the 5 of the main planning interfaces among the 4 planning areas. Those 5 planning interfaces include generation and transmission planning, or G&T, T&D, D&C, G&D, G&C. And again, for each of these planning interfaces, we apply the walk, jog, run framework. So again, you can see there's some combinatorics here, right? I really encourage you to consult the guidebook, if you want to get the sort of breadth of knowledge and really get an appreciation for it as a reference. But just to give you a flavor, let's look at the G&T planning interface. And let's look at what that walk, jog, run framework looks like for G&T planning. So walking in the G&T space, what does it look like for generation and transmission planners to walk with one another? Well, what we do in the guidebook is we call out what transmission planners need to understand about generation planners and what generation planners need to understand about transmission planners, right? And so one of the things that came up from our literature review and interviews, terminology, right? People using the same words, but they have slightly different meanings. So the term scenario, right? To a generation planner scenario, maybe we're talking about a specific model run and a specific set of input assumptions and constraints, maybe plausible conditions around resource costs and natural gas prices, right? That's kind of what scenario might mean to a generation planner. But to a transmission planner, scenario might mean, different operational situations that are handled by the same generation portfolio. And they're using the same word, and so miscommunication is very possible. And so if you're going to start to integrate your planning processes, it's important to get ahead of those miscommunication possibilities and start aligning your terminology. So we give you, the guidebook gives some sort of practical ways that you can align some terminology, and also about how do you start conversations around modeling abstractions, right? How are line losses approached from a transmission planning perspective? How are line losses approached from a generation perspective? Again, all those sort of details are in the guidebook. So that's the walk stage, walking of G&T walking. At the jog stage, it's about aligning data in space and time. So as far as space, right, we give some really practical approaches for spatial mapping, right? How do you map the nodes in my generation model to the buses in my transmission, to the buses and the transmission models, right? That's sort of a spatial disaggregation, and we give some tips on how you can do that, based on how people are doing that today. So that's mapping, that's aligning data in space. You can also do that in time, right? So how do you move the chronological dispatches determined from generation planners? How do you move that chronological information to the transmission planners, right? How do you unlock transmission planners to do a full 8760 analysis to uncover new at-risk operating conditions, and we can move beyond sort of the historical peak scenarios. So that's walk stage, jog. Finally, we have the run stage. Now at the run stage, we're talking about modeling. And what we are going to see is that, what we're pitching here, it isn't a replacement for generation planning. And it isn't a replacement for transmission planning. This is an integrated workflow that can be done in parallel with existing planning processes and done in an incremental fashion, right? This doesn't have to be a huge lift, right? How does this relate to IRP? This is a question we got a lot when we were preparing this. Well, Aaron, and Aaron's going to talk a lot about, some of the optimization approaches, but how does this relate to IRP and sort of the optimization approaches? We are providing a G&T approach that improves the outcome of the IRP process, right? And vice versa, the IRP process feeds into this process, right? These are about sort of synergistic outcomes. So I'm going to park on this slide for a minute. So, stay, just, you can hang out. It's going to be a while on the slide, but, this is really, so I want to give a real flavor of what we do in this guidebook. So what does it mean for generation and transmission planners to run with one another? Well, that starts by defining a base case system plan that you're planning against. This could come from IRP or maybe of policy requirements. We're going to talk about that more in a second. Now, at a high level, the integrated planning process that we're talking about in this guidebook is about tightening the feedback between generation planning, the economics of generation planning, and the reliability assessments that come from transmission planning. And active power set points are sort of the contract between the two. And the really important part here is this feedback, right? How does the reliability concerns that come from the transmission planning feedback as constraints in our generation planning? So let's unpack this a little bit more. When we're talking about generation planning, again, we're not replacing generation planning. We're saying this is a flavor or sort of a core part of generation planning. We're talking about running production cost models, right? How do you move information in an integrated fashion? How do you move information from a production cost model to active power set points that can be helpful for transmission planning? In the transmission planning side, again, this isn't meant to be a thing that replaces an entire transmission planning study, but just gives you a flavor of transmission planning. We're talking about system conditioning, right? Transmission planners are trying to figure out periods that violate physics, right? Are problems for reliability. Now, historically, transmission planners, we're maybe looking at winter and summer peaks, right? But today, other stress periods may exist. And so the idea here is, how can we do a full 8760 analysis of reliability? And we give some targeted recommendations on how you can apply heuristics. So you don't have to do an actual, a transmission study on 8,760 time steps. Maybe there's actually ways that you can look at a subset of them. And we talk a lot about sort of practical reliability screening techniques. Maybe there's contingency analysis. We get into a lot more depth in the guidebook about how this works. But again, the important thing in this process is about closing the loop, right? Taking those reliability concerns and feeding them back to the production cost model as constraints, right? Again, it's about that tightening that feedback loop. So once you're sort of starting to converge, right, you have to compare these different system plans that you come up with. This comparison is often a multi-objective problem, right? How do you balance sort of cost effectiveness and reliability? In the guidebook, we give some targeted recommendations and some examples of cost effectiveness tests that are very common in the industry today. What's important, though, is that this workflow isn't done in isolation. This workflow is meant to be done in parallel, right? So the takeaways that you get from this analysis, right? Maybe you uncover new operational constraints, that are really important to study for your system. Well, that's information that can be fed into these optimization processes or your IRP process. Again, right? This isn't a replacement for IRP. This isn't IRP 2.0. This is how to enhance IRP, right? How to make the IRP process go more smoothly and ultimately produce better outcomes. Once you have more agreement, right, you can say that you've reached a reasonable planning state. And again, the foundations paper that Aaron talked about some of the ideas of how often you would do these integrated planning workflows. So I won't go into that here. So that's what it looks like for generation and transmission planners to run together, right? And I'm going to take a step back. we do that same, we approach each of the 5 planning interfaces that I showed on the previous screen with this same level of technical rigor, right? And so, I can't go into the depth for this presentation, but I really want to encourage you to consult the guidebook. If you're want to do, generation customer, integrated planning, consult the chapter on that. So that's sort of the heart of the guidebook, the walk, jog, run integrated planning framework. What's the value of all this integration? Well, Aaron actually talked a lot about sort of the value of integration, of integrated planning from a high level, so I won't rehash that here. But what I do want to highlight, the thing that's unique about the guidebook is that we actually explore what is the unique value of integrated planning for each planning interface. So we say, what's the value of doing generation and transmission planning? And we give concrete examples. What's the value of doing integrated transmission and distribution planning? And we give concrete examples with the spotlights and whatnot. So, again, I would point you to the guidebook, if you're looking for a reference on sort of, maybe some more specifics on the values of integrated planning, especially when it comes to some of the emerging planning interfaces that are being integrated. So how do we unlock this value, right? There's all this great value. How do we actually unlock it? This guidebook is software agnostic, but we want it to be practical, right? And we recognize that these workflows will be done in software. They are already being done in software. So to strike a compromise between sort of being tool agnostic and practical, we wanted to describe some of the concepts that go into integrated planning software. These concepts include spatially referenced data, right? Again, remember in that jog stage, I was talking about aligning data inputs and outputs. So for example, if you're mapping distribution feeders to your transmission model nodes, that's going to be a lot easier to do that mapping if it's a spatial query, right? If you're trying to match with names, that can be pretty hard to do, right? Sometimes having the spatial data is really key. And so from a software perspective, important to have spatially referenceable data. Allowing the modeling domains to operate with one another. We saw that was really important in the run stage of integrated generation and transmission planning. How can I have a data set that I can apply a production cost model on and an AC power flow model on top of, right? And I'm not having to run a bunch of these different translators. High dimensional data processing, that's really important for integrated workflows, right? That can look like data visualization or statistical / machine learning / AI algorithms that allow you to turn data into insights, right? That's kind of what we're talking about there. Computational performance, that's also really important, right? And Aaron talked about this with cloud computing and parallelizability of these workflows, right? Sometimes these workflows are very expensive, and we need to think about ways to speed them up so they can actually be run in tractable amounts of time. And that last point about streaming multi-model interactions, right? Today, that usually either looks like a middleware, so it's a software that's connecting different software, or maybe it's a new single software that contains multiple modeling domains. So fortunately, there are many emerging examples of integrated planning software. One that's really near and dear to my heart because I work at encoord is SAINT, the scenario analysis interface for energy planning, which is the integrated planning solution that encoord provides, right? This is the tool that me and my team, we work on day in and day out. We live it. We obsess over how you can make integrated planning into a user experience. But again, the guidebook is tool agnostic. There are no references to any specific software. So in order for planners to understand their planning context, right? We talked about that in the early chapter. In order to run integrated planning workflows, we talked about that in the following chapter. And in order to run integrated planning software, what I just talked about on this slide, the organizations must be prepared. And that's what the final chapter talks about. What does integrated planning look like to be, when it's implemented? And so, in our interviews, that really comes down to thoughtful change management. That was a really common topic when we did our literature review and our interviews. A lot of the traditional change management practices may not be suitable. Sometimes these silos are well rooted in complex math, in the complex math of power systems. And so it's not just a matter of getting people into the same room or having them report to the same person. It might be about getting them to speak the same language, which is why that walk phase is really powerful in our walk, jog, run framework. Speaking of our framework, one of the recommendations for leadership is to adopt a similar walk, jog, run framework for your organization, right? It really helps you to figure out where you've been, where you're going, where you may have missed gaps along your integrated planning journey. And finally, really, and Aaron mentioned this before, pilot projects, right? That's really what integrated planning looks like from a practical perspective for organizations today. Those pilot projects don't have to be a huge lift, and we talk about what an ideal candidate for a pilot project looks like. So in closing, I know it's been said before, but I want to give some special thank yous. First of all, to the ESIG staff at all levels. This document changed forms many times, and I really want to thank ESIG for their patience and guidance as we made this document. To the task force members for the many hours of thoughtful discussions and feedback on the guidebook. To the people who we interviewed, the dozens of people that we talked to, it was really great to hear the firsthand experience on integrated planning. And finally, last but not least, to the guidebook reviewers. We had over 500 comments on this guidebook. And it was really amazing to see these thoughtful discussions with market operators, utility planners, researchers, software vendors, all arguing about the wording of a footnote. Right? In all seriousness, I really believe that that's what integrated planning looks like. And it was really beautiful to see integrated planning happening in a guidebook written about integrated planning. So last but not least, please read and share the guidebook. We're going to take a few questions now, and then I think we're going to loop back with more questions later. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Great presentation. Hey, there were a couple questions on Slido about how to access the guidebook. Just a reminder, the guidebook and all three of these reports, including the guidebook, are posted on ESIG's website, publicly available. The link to that posting is in the chat. So you can find the link in the chat to access the guidebook and the other reports. Let's take one question before we move on. Jacob, is integrated generation and transmission planning compatible with the strict separation between generation and transmission in integrated utilities in the U.S.?
You want to take this one, Wallace? You can take it if you want.
Yeah, sure. Am I unmuted? You can hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, good. Okay, so great. It's a really good question, and I would say throughout the guidebook, we were attempting to be organizational structural agnostic insofar as we're talking more about the flow of information between what these planning entities would be doing. I expect that this particular question is probably seeded from some recent FERC orders that are restricting the flow of information between generation and transmission operators, which is more based on market type analysis. And for the purposes of long-term planning, we don't see that sort of strict separation getting in the way of meaningful planning. I mean, at the end of the day, someone's going to have to be considering how the transmission system is working with the selected generation assets and those sorts of portfolios. So you'll have to manage the information at some point between them. But
great response. Thank you, gentlemen. Aaron, let's turn back to you for our third and final presentation today. Again, folks, keep entering questions at slido.com. There's also a button a thumbs up button where you can vote to prioritize questions. And we hope to have 5 or 10 minutes at the end here to take a few more questions, and we'll try to send out responses to questions we don't get to. So with that, go ahead, Aaron, take us home here.
Okay, great, thank you. So I will now talk about the third paper in this series. So this paper is focused on optimization modeling within the context of integrated planning. And specifically, it's teeing up the question of how to build on the optimization framework of capacity expansion that's used in IRPs or generation planning, and what are the opportunities and the current challenges for trying to expand that optimization to other planning domains. So the paper starts off by setting the foundation for what capacity expansion modeling is. So how is the optimization problem defined today? what are some of the current trade-offs that have to be made. Then we talk about the opportunities and challenges of what we call full system optimization. So this would be capacity expansion for both generation as well as transmission and distribution grids and customer resources. And then we separate the co-optimization question into the bulk grid co-optimization and then bulk plus local grid co-optimization. Present some of the challenges of the full system approach and some tractable methods that can combine partial co-optimization and iterative feedbacks, as was mentioned earlier. Then we conclude again with a walk, jog, run framework that is specific to developing the data and the analytical capabilities to explore some of these novel approaches. So this should look familiar to any IRP folks on the call. This is basically the optimization problem definition for capacity expansion. So we have a set of key inputs. Those are our load and DER forecasts. We've got baseline resources. We have resource potential and cost for candidate resource options, definitions of resource adequacy need. The optimization itself is typically a cost minimization of fixed plus variable costs, and that is subject to a variety of constraints that can be categorized into reliability and policy buckets. And then the outputs of that optimization are the generation capacity additions and retirements by year, what the generation by resource looks like, what the policy targets, the achievement relative to those policy targets are, and costs, the model costs within the optimization. So when we think about this optimization problem, we thought it was useful to start by recognizing some of the trade-offs that we already have to make just to solve the generation problem before we think about expanding the optimization to encompass additional planning domains. So here you have these spider diagrams that show some of the power system models that are used out there and how much detail they go into on each of these five considerations. So for capacity expansion, I'll walk through some of these trade-offs. So for spatial granularity, these models are often run in a zonal format, and more detailed siting is addressed downstream of the optimization. For temporal granularity, typically there is the use of representative days or weeks instead of looking at all hours of the year. Operations is usually an approximation of unit commitment and dispatch. Grid physics is generally limited, so you may have zone-to-zone transfer limits, but no power flow constraints. And capacity expansion really focuses a lot of its computational horsepower on resource options. So we want to explore this very large solution space of potential portfolios. But even there's some trade-offs involved. So for instance, we may consider linear decision variables instead of integer variables for each plant. And then in the blue boxes, we show some of the dimensions upon which we would need to expand to do more integrated optimization. So we need more spatial granularity. As Jacob noted earlier, we need a better representation of some of the physical constraints, and we need to consider new types of resource options. So this is a diagram from the paper that goes into the opportunities of an integrated full system optimization. And it does so by mapping out some of the upstream studies and downstream studies that go into and follow capacity expansion. And so the concept of a full system optimization is to move some of the analysis that happens in those upstream and downstream studies into the optimization itself to make it endogenous. So we highlighted 5 key opportunities of doing that. So the first is we can consider DERs as resource options instead of just as a forecast. We can potentially consider the local grid constraints that will allow us to capture the full value that those DERs can provide. We could look as well at the bulk grid constraints and what are the solutions to address congestion or deliverability. We can incorporate some of the more physical transmission reliability needs explored in power flow and stability analysis to ensure that our investments and our dispatch modeled represent system needs. And then we can ensure there's a consistent valuation between supply side and demand side resources. So these are the key opportunities that are presented by this theoretical full system optimization. However, there are also some key challenges. So starting here with the computational challenges. So there is a trade-off in how much spatial granularity you can capture versus model runtime and computational tractability. As I'll note shortly, capturing full detail down to the distribution level is generally intractable. So that's something that we need to overcome. And on the data side, there is significant new data development that is required with varying degrees of difficulty. So you have more geospatial data that has to be developed on loads and resources. You have to develop new options for grid upgrades if you want the model to be able to optimize those. So those include looking at both the technical capabilities of upgrades as well as their costs and feasibility screens. So can you actually build a new transmission line where a model might think it is cost effective, as well as ways that you may need to aggregate DERs of the thousands of potential DERs to make it a tractable set of modeling inputs. And then aside from some of the technical challenges, there are also process challenges. So whenever we run an optimization, it can, we run the risk of being overconfident in a specific outcome. So as planners, we have to have humility and understand that there is uncertainty in our inputs and that there are additional considerations to decision-making beyond just the least cost optimization when we hit go on the model. So there are considerations of risk, feasibility, equity amongst different customer classes beyond just the optimization process. And then lastly, even if we could build a model that could optimize everything, we have to recognize that the decision-making venues for different planning domains may be different, and the timelines for those may be different. So I'll talk shortly about some recommendations that we make to overcome some of these process challenges. So starting with the bulk grid co-optimization question, we found, and the task force agreed, that current models today, so current capacity expansion models, are well positioned to co-optimize generation, transmission, and energy storage siting. And we talk about a few different ways, non-mutually exclusive ways that those can be incorporated into the optimization problem. So we have this table here. In the first column, you see there is no integration. So this is the sort of siloed one-way flow approach. We run a coarse capacity expansion model without any transmission limits, and we try to figure out where to put resources and what transmission infrastructure to build out downstream of that. So that is not an integrated planning approach. And then the second column here is looking at a two-way flow of information. So here we have a generation plan. It may still be like a zonal coarse dispatch, but you pass information so you can run your expansion, do a transmission analysis, put that back into the generation expansion. So this can allow you to come to some integrated solutions, but it's relatively inefficient to be passing information back and forth between those complex models. So then in the lighter blue and orange columns, we have co-optimization approaches. And so these are characterized into two different types. So we have the first type that maintains a coarser dispatch granularity, so you may still have a zonal dispatch, but it includes detailed transmission limits. And this can be particularly useful for remote renewable resources, and they can be defined either at the resource level or they can be defined in a transmission zone. Define them in a transmission zone allows for consideration of diversity. So you can add solar and storage together to maximize transmission utilization, for instance, within that context. And then on the right, we have hourly flow constraints, also known as pipe and bubble representation. So you can have interzonal upgrades that can be selected by the model. So this could be looking at interregional transmission, for instance, HVDC, et cetera. You can also have intrazonal. So this would be within your primary investment zone in the model. You would break up the granularity of the dispatch, so you'd have to develop subzone definitions for resources and loads and allow the model to upgrade between those zones. And then on the right is the full nodal approach, which requires consideration of DC power flow to really get right, and this therefore requires significantly higher computational capabilities. And it requires a lot more data, so you need resource potential and loads by each node. So this is, folks are doing this currently, but it does require significantly more data and significantly more computation. So then when we move to thinking about including local grid optimization, so this would be customer sited resources, or distribution sited DERs, as well as what the needs, grid upgrade needs of the distribution system are. We have to think about the relative scale. So if we have a single zonal system optimization, that is one load forecast, it's one set of dispatch that we need to model. If we want to break that up into multiple transmission zones for bulk grid co-optimization, then we have to develop a load forecast for each of those transmission zones and a resource potential forecast and study storage dispatch within each of them. If we were to try to expand that all the way down to the distribution system, you'd be talking about hundreds or potentially thousands of individual load to resource balances that you would need to capture that full detail. And we find that for most systems, this is going to be computationally intractable. So we have this diagram that shows some of the options for how we can define those local grid values for DERs and some of the trade-offs therein. So option one is to take a system level average. So this is also known as peanut buttering that distribution value. So this is computationally tractable, but it doesn't really get you any useful information about where resources provide value to the distribution grid. You can consider the T&D interface. So this could be a distribution planning area or like the 69 kV interface. And this is kind of balances, so it may be computationally tractable, but it's still not a super precise circuit level measurement of the value and the marginal costs on the distribution grid. If you go all the way down to the circuit level, that's where you get that really precise value, but it's too much data to be computationally tractable. So there are potentially other methods that sit between option 2 and 3, so grouping of feeders into archetypes, but no one has really developed a single approach here that can consistently scale to allow this kind of full system optimization. So in recognizing that, we present 3 alternatives in this paper that use a combination of co-optimization for some parts of the power system and iterative loops for other parts of the system. So the first is looking at marginal hourly avoided costs. So this is similar to the approach that is used by the California Public Utilities Commission in their IRP and DER planning processes. So you start with a load forecast and a baseline DER forecast that then informs a bulk grid co-optimization of generation and transmission. You can include some additional optimized DERs within that if you want. And out of that process comes a portfolio that can be used to develop marginal hourly avoided costs. So this would involve using production cost modeling for hourly energy and AS costs, and then pulling from the expansion model the reliability and policy value that different resources can provide. This can be supplemented by additional transmission analysis to avoid when resources can avoid transmission, as well as where. And then the distribution component is flexible here in the sense that you can define it however you want based on your use case. So if you're really focused on considering circuit level distribution deferrals, for instance, you can screen those through your distribution planning processes, and you can provide a precise measurement of those places on your system where DERs can provide distribution deferral and the hours in which they would need to output to do so. And then that can all flow into a 8760 hourly avoided cost model. So here we're showing the average hourly value of different categories of components, but that would be 8760 across your planning horizon, and then that can be used to inform DER cost effectiveness analysis. It could be used to inform future rate designs and how those might flow into DER customer adoption, for instance, looking at adoption propensity modeling and other tools like that. The second alternative kind of rearranges the question. So instead of trying to take the single system optimization and put a whole lot of individual local circuit optimizations into that process, it takes the results of the bulk grid co-optimization, it creates a set of hourly bulk grid avoided costs, and then it takes that information into many different local grid optimizations. And so these local grid optimizations are often referred to as integrated distribution system planning. So this is where we can look at the incremental DER costs minus their bulk grid value versus the cost of upgrading the distribution system and run that optimization within the distribution planning process. That can then get fed back if incremental DERs come out of that to produce the final G&T expansion. And then alternative 3 really starts with the distribution planning process. So here we have a starting point of forecasted loads and DERs that informs a distribution planning assessment of where there is capacity need and what the marginal costs are to address that need. From that, you can parameterize the value that different DERs can provide based on their load shapes to support those distribution system needs. And this again comes back to the challenge of kind of parameterizing that into a capacity expansion model. We discussed some options for doing that in the paper. But the result is that you have an expansion then that can consider generation, transmission, and DER values using these marginal distribution grid values. And you may need to run that through a loop. For instance, if you pick more DERs, then there'll be less distribution value to avoid. So this can iterate to convergence. So while this paper is mostly quite technical in looking at optimization challenges and opportunities, we also conclude with a section that focuses on how to design integrated planning processes to ensure that they can support decision making. So again, if you have this super fancy optimization approach, it's not very useful if you can't actually ensure that those optimized solutions can be implemented in the real world. So we have 4 different recommendations that we propose in thinking about designing integrated planning processes. The first is to align those planning processes with the decision-making venues and timelines for those. So again, this is particularly critical where you may have different decision makers with different venues, and there could be, for instance, dependencies between being able to get one part of your plan approved as it impacts another part of your plan. There's the opportunity for process consolidation. So that could be combining processes or even regulatory proceedings to create the most efficient approach for planners and other stakeholders. It could involve organizational restructuring. We don't recommend this categorically, but it's important for folks to ask whether their business structures align with efficient decision-making. And then, as we talked about earlier, using pilot projects to validate new types of approaches is really critical. So that is really foundational to starting to explore, for instance, value stack solutions in an integrated process, and then validate the operations and commercial terms, et cetera, of those types of opportunities before the next planning cycle. And then lastly, we have this walk, jog, run. So I won't go into all the detail here. You can read this in the paper, but again, this walk phase is really about identifying gaps, starting to align some of the scenarios. The jog phase is really about developing the new data that's required for integrated optimization, and building new modeling capabilities as well as process refinement. And then the run phase is where you get into some of the more novel types of co-optimization approaches and iterative loops that we talked about earlier. With that, I will turn it back to Matt for our Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Aaron. Great presentation. We've got some questions coming in. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes to address questions that we can. So let's start with Aaron. I think this is directed to you. Question is, did you take into account some kind of a carbon budget in the integrated planning? The example that's given here is the 10-year network development plan for Europe's electricity infrastructure developed by ENSO-E. But just generally, how would outside objectives, policy objectives like that come into account?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, that for decarbonizing regions, there are some interesting integrated planning questions that emerge, both within electricity planning as well as between electric power system and other systems. But integrated planning can really be applied in non-decarbonizing regions as well. It's not like it's only useful for regions that have carbon targets. But when you do have carbon policies, those can be explored both within electricity system planning. So those are often set as optimization constraints within your generation capacity expansion, for instance. You can also consider when you have an economy-wide carbon target, how different sectors through scenario analysis, how much to push carbon reduction in different sectors and how that impacts affordability and feasibility. So as I showed some of the integrated scenario analysis from our Rhode Island work earlier, that really allows you to see how cost effective it is to push, for instance, full electrification versus partial electrification, or should you go to a zero emissions electric power system versus maintaining some emissions in the electric power system. Those are really important questions for planners in decarbonizing regions to consider.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Jacob, let's go to you for the next question. Any broad thoughts on implications for delivery time of a full integrated process versus a typical IRP of similar scope? And I think that last phrase is probably the key, of similar scope, but
yes,
any overall thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the timing of this depends on one, which planning interface you're looking at, right? So like a GNT type of integrated workflow might look very different from like a transmission and distribution, and the timing of those might be different. So I want to say it's hard to give a broad answer, but what I would say is generally they happen on smaller timescales, right? Than your kind of classic transmission study or your classic IRP process. I want to also pass it to Wallace, because Wallace and I were actually literally discussing this earlier, so I know he had some thoughts around like the timing of these studies. And I think also Aaron, it'd be great to hear because the foundations paper also talks about the timing of integrated planning as it relates to other things. So maybe pass it to Wallace and then.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. With respect to sort of the likely multi-year rollout of an IRP, with respect to what we're talking about in the guidebook is more about improving the interactions with the other planning entities. So if you were to look at the IRP process, but also rolling that into transmission analyses, which would perhaps be happening on an annual basis to better inform your inputs to your IRP, along with what might be an IDRP, which is becoming a bit more common, the Integrated Distribution Resource Plan. So it's about better aligning the inputs and outputs of those types of studies to arrive at a more holistic solution. So whereas a traditional IRP might have 2% or 3% of the pages dedicated to transmission and distribution in entirety, it would be about bolstering those inputs to better understand the real capacities of those systems to handle the generation asks. But as far as time scale, I mean, certainly not more than the sum of those three. But to Jacob's point, it's more about taking targeted approaches to specific questions to better understand holistic solutions that could be accommodated by the various planning domains. So with that, Aaron, anything you would throw in there?
I'll just add, I think we've seen different folks take different approaches here. So we've seen some integrated planning processes that have really tried to bite off a lot in the first cycle, and that has led to extended timelines versus traditional IRP processes. And we've seen others that have taken a more incremental approach that can fit within historical IRP timelines. So I think part of it is kind of a matter of how much you want to bite off in your first round, whether you want to take a more incremental approach or really dive into the deep end. But yeah, we are talking about doing potentially additional analyses or additional data development, as well as iterations between different planning processes. So this can add additional time and resources needed to the planning process.
Yeah, great, good responses. Aaron, let's start with you on this next question, but Jacob, Wallace, you may have thoughts to add after that also. Aaron, I know you've been involved in supporting various planning efforts in various jurisdictions, and that more and more stakeholder input, particularly from public and citizens, is becoming more and more an important part of the planning process. The questioner asks, how and when do you engage citizens who can play a significant role in enabling or frankly stopping plans from progressing through the process? And do you have a thought in the integrated planning process of where that best fits in?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, but it's also going to be pretty divergent depending on what kind of process you're talking about. So, for instance, some of the municipal utilities that have pursued integrated planning have taken a really comprehensive stakeholder approach. So that might include public informational meetings. It might include a separate technical task force focused on getting into more of the modeling and data input details. Other processes may go through regulatory processes that have their own kind of stakeholder engagement approaches. So those are generally a bit more formal, more about developing a record that could support decision making. So I'd say there's kind of a wide diversity of if, how, and when to bring in stakeholder viewpoints. But I would just really echo that I think it's generally foundational and critical to ensure that folks are following along with the planning process. I think this has been apparent within IRPs already. And here we're talking about expanded planning process. You know, I would say some of the T&D planning processes historically have been a little bit less accessible to stakeholders due to their more technical nature, more sort of internal focus. So I think it is important to understand how much detail to go in with stakeholders and which type of stakeholders to approach and how. But I will say, particularly having a technical panel that can really help to validate planners and bring in some of the stakeholders who have that type of expertise is really critical to any planning process.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in really quickly. I think one thing that we approach this question from the guidebook is it's about how do you translate the value to something that's going to be relevant to stakeholders, right? So like in the modeling domain, we like to nerd out about convergence and passing data around, but that how does that value actually translate to customers? And we got a lot of those insights. I'll just plug this. HECO does a IGP, an integrated grid plan, and if you read their reports, whoever asked this question, if you look at the HECO IGP, like their appendix is all about sort of how they set up stakeholder workshops and how they engage with folks to translate the value of what they're doing to something that's practical for stakeholders. So that's all I'll say on that.
Great, thanks. We have more questions, but unfortunately we're at about time, so we're going to need to wrap it up. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out to everyone who registered once the video file and slides have been posted. And we will try to answer questions that we didn't get to and get those posted as quickly as we can. I want to thank Aaron and the E3 team, Jacob and the encoord team, and the members of the ESIG Integrated Planning Task Force for their terrific work on these 3 new reports on integrated planning. I also want to thank again ESIG members. Your support does make these webinars and the other work we do possible. Folks can get further information on all our ESIG's webinars and meetings found at our website, www.esig.energy under events, and in our newsletters and information emails. You're all invited to attend. ESIG's holding a forecasting and markets workshop in Nashville next week, and a one-day workshop on large loads and how they will interact with the resource adequacy in markets. So we really appreciate everyone's engagement. We look forward to seeing you all again. And with that, we're adjourned for today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.